My name is Troy Lanigan. I'm president of the Canada Strong and Free Network. I want to welcome you to June's Exchange Call. First and foremost, we could not do these without sponsorship, so a very special thank you to our sponsor, the Modern Miracle Network. Thank you also to our outstanding panelists, who we will get to shortly. Just a couple of quick housekeeping matters before we get started. First of all, we are going to let the chat function run today. And I just give the usual reminder that we will remove anyone posting rude or objectionable comments. Otherwise, encourage you to please chat during the conversation today. The chat is for commentary and networking. The Q&A box at the bottom of your screen is for questions, and myself and our moderator will look into the Q&A box throughout the session and get those questions to our moderator as best we can. Second, if you have any suggestions on future topics, please connect through our website or email me directly at troy@canadastrongandfree.network. Zoe, if you'd put that into my address into the chat box, I'd appreciate it. In July, we're looking at a conversation around housing policy. So if you have any suggestions on that, happy to hear from you as well. Finally, this Zoom call will be recorded and posted on our website approximately 2 hours after the call. Actually, I should just comment, I don't see JJ McCullough on yet. Hopefully he will join us. So we are down one panelist right now, but I talked to him yesterday and hopefully he should be able to join us. I hope he can. With that, I always try to invite different folks in the movement to host and to moderate these calls. And I'm very pleased to welcome for the first time on our exchange call as a moderator, our friend John Robson, who I've known best over the years for his many columns, his commentaries, in trips to Civitas. But I'd also like to plug his initiative, the Climate Discussion Nexus. John, you might be getting in trouble with that, with this C-10 legislation. So I'll ask Zoe to put that link in to chat as well, and encourage everyone that's watching today to connect in and check some of the great work out that he's doing there. So with that, John, welcome. Thank you for doing this, and hand it over to you for the next hour.
Well, thank you, Troy. Thank you to our panelists, and thank you to our audience. It's a great turnout here. And yes, you're right. In this case, I'm not only the moderator, I'm also a client. So I have a dog in this fight. And we are going to have a good look at this fight over the next hour. And one of my many odd qualities, I'm a real stickler for time, so it will be an hour. We appreciate people coming. We said an hour, and that's what it will be. Our panel, of course, are mostly well known to you, but I will remind you that Rachael Harder has been the MP for Lethbridge since 2015. She's the Shadow Minister for Digital Government, and she's also a member of the Standing Committee on Government Operations and Estimates, and former chair of the Standing Committee on Access to Information, Privacy, and Ethics. And her bio also says that she grew up on a farm and at age 11 started her own business raising dogs and running a kennel. So all of that might be some use in dealing with her fellow politicians, down, heel, etc. Peter Menzies is a former vice chair for telecommunications and the Alberta and Northwest Territories Regional Commissioner for the CRTC. So he knows the beast from inside its belly. He's now a senior fellow with the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, where I used to work, and he was the editor at the Calgary Herald when I worked there during a certain unpleasantness. So I want to assure you that I'm not stalking him, and he's not stalking me. I think he's too busy with charitable work and writing. We also have Joanna Barron, who's the executive director of the Canadian Constitution Foundation, which, again, is a legal charity that defends our liberties in courts of law, but also in the court of public opinion. She's also founding director of the Runnymede Society, which I think is a great initiative to give law students a grounding in classical liberal views of law. You can imagine how the word Runnymede resonates with me because I made a documentary on Magna Carta. And of course, I very much like the thought of having a baron at Runnymede. But I digress. Our final panelist, JJ McCullough, is a weekly columnist at the Washington Post in the Global Opinion section. But the main relevance of his career here is that he's also a YouTuber with over 300,000 subscribers. So again, if I'm a client, boy, he's a client. And he previously worked for Sun News as well as CTV. His writings and cartoons have been widely published here and in the United States. So he's the sort of person the government wishes they could find some way to hit the mute button on. And speaking of hitting the mute button, I suppose as moderator, I'm not meant to talk, but if you give me a mic, you get what you deserve. though only briefly here. I want to mention that 2 years ago, this is like in that distant past when I didn't actually own a mask, I had a chance, along with Mark Stein and Lindsay Shepherd, to speak before the House of Commons Standing Committee on Justice and Human Rights, and to remind them of John Stuart Mill's classic threefold defense of free speech. First, an unfamiliar and obnoxious-looking idea might turn out to be true. Second, if it's not true, sunlight destroys evil, the so-called Dracula effect. And third, if a familiar, comfortable idea is challenged and it's defended successfully, the process of defending it can elevate it from stale dogma to living truth. But I have to say that these ideas, like much that I write, didn't seem to interest many of the MPs. So instead, they've uncorked Bill C-10, among other attacks on the ability of citizens to tell sense from nonsense and decency from deplorability. I think they really don't trust us, and I think that's at the root of it. And so just before I turn it over to the panel, I want to remind you of what Frederick Douglass said in Boston in 1860. He said, "To suppress free speech is a double wrong. It violates the right of the hearer as well as those of the speaker." And he said, "It is just as criminal to rob a man of his right to speak and hear as it would be to rob him of his money." And I think it's a very important point always that the attack on free speech isn't just an attack on the people whose views the government does not want to hear or doesn't want you to hear. It's an attack on your right to hear those views and think for yourself about whether they make sense or not. So to me, this is a very important issue. To the government, apparently it's not. The Prime Minister has called opponents of C-10 tinfoil hatters, and his Culture Minister said only extremists could oppose it. So without further ado, I want to find out what's inside our panelist hats. And I'm going to start with Rachael Harder to talk about what's in the bill, where it stands in the legislature, then Peter Menzies for a view of how it's likely to unfold. Joanna Barron will give us an analysis of the legalities, and JJ McCullough will tell us how it looks from sort of underneath the boot. As I say, it astonishes my kids that I, of all people, am a YouTuber, but nothing like his league. So he'll speak to that one. So Rachael Harder, thanks so much for being with us. And why don't you give us a sense of what's in the bill and how fast is it coming at us?
Sure. Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to open up. So a quick overview of the bill. The bill was first brought forward in the House of Commons in the fall. And at that point in time, it wasn't an ideal bill, but there weren't things that were of great significance or concern to us at that point in time. However, upon further evaluation, we have recognized that there are actually significant flaws to it. Further to that, however, the biggest thing that happened is that in April of this year, so just about 7 weeks ago, when the bill was before committee, which is Heritage Committee, going through clause by clause, which means that each line is evaluated and it's determined whether or not it's kept in the bill or taken out of the bill. During that process, what ended up happening was that a motion was moved to remove what is called Section 4.1. Now, Section 4.1 provided protection for content, the content that you, me, other Canadians might post online, whether that's on our social media platforms such as Facebook or other platforms such as YouTube or TikTok. And so our content was originally protected from government regulation. That's a good thing. We want that freedom to be able to express ourselves, to share our ideas, to post videos, to put content out there for the world to see. When that clause was removed, however, our freedom, our protection went with it. In other words, now the content that is posted online can be and would be subject to government regulation should Bill C-10 become law. What that means is that you then have an arm of the government, the CRTC, determining whether or not your content makes the cut in terms of what the government is calling its level of Canadianness. So if it's super Canadian, then maybe it'll get bumped up in the queue in terms of discoverability. In other words, how seeable it is. And if it's not so Canadian, maybe a 4 out of 10, well, then it gets bumped down. So what this does then is it actually impacts our ability to access information as viewers, and it impacts the ability of millions of Canadians and even the ability of global audiences in order to be able to see those videos or those posts as we might wish to. In addition to that, of course, it has a huge impact on the creators themselves, as has been said. And that is to say, creators, they put content out there and they go to work in the process of being able to generate support very organically, and gain a name for themselves. As a result, they have an audience and they curate their content for that audience. What this bill would do is the government would come along, again, through their regulatory arm, and they would say, well, actually, this content isn't super Canadian. So instead of you being able to promote yourself organically, we're actually going to bump that down a notch. We don't really want that to be so discoverable. Meanwhile, they're going to go and find other content and they're going to be like, wow, this is amazing content. We're going to give that a 9 out of 10 or a 10 out of 10. So rather than you being able to organically promote yourself, we're going to boost you even further. We're going to pick you as a winner. Ultimately, then what you have is you have a bill that will result in picking and choosing winners and losers. And so some artists, of course, will get the good side of this and they'll be promoted, and other artists will get demoted. And then, of course, we as viewers and millions of other Canadians will also be impacted, because some content they'll be able to access very easily and other content they just simply won't. And so right now in committee, this is being discussed. As Conservatives, we've brought forward an amendment to bring back the mechanism that would protect our content. That just happened on Monday. Unfortunately, it was voted down. So we continue forward looking at the bill and evaluating it each clause at a time. And as Conservatives, we're going to do everything that we can to stall this bill and to prevent it from going through in any sort of speedy fashion. Our hope is that it actually dies altogether, because we believe that Bill C-10 needs to die and that a new bill needs to be drafted. One that would be actually helpful in terms of moving forward, rather than this one, which we believe is extremely detrimental.
Okay, and now, Peter, having been inside the CRTC, you have a possibly gruesome but certainly well-informed view. If the bill passes, how will it actually be implemented? Who's going to have power over what we say, and how in practice will that power be exercised, or indeed not exercised? Because bureaucracies are often places where a lot of things don't happen very slowly.
Sure. Assuming the bill does get passed, which I hope it doesn't, because what Canada really needs is a new Communications Act, not a new Broadcasting Act. It needs to grandfather broadcasting in a sense, in terms of that, and actually recognize what communications is in the 21st century as opposed to the 20th century. But if it gets passed, because this act gives sweeping powers to the CRTC and incredible responsibilities for definition to the CRTC, which include defining its own scope on things, what it decides to forbear upon, and not, and leave alone, in other words, and what it decides to act on. It needs, first of all, to define what social media is. Because the bill doesn't define that. So that'll be a process unto itself. The promised order in council that goes with it will insist that they consult from coast to coast to coast with various Indigenous groups and marginalized, racialized segments of society before they do anything else. So that process in itself would take at least a year, possibly two. The process of defining scope and what social media is. In other words, all this stuff has to be done before they actually get started. That would be at least a couple of years. And then you get into public hearings, consultations here and there across the board, that sort of stuff. I would say, there's there's content producers who think they're going to get a bunch of money out of this. I would say it will be, best case scenario, 8 years before they see a dime, likely closer to 10 years. And in the meantime, that creates a period of uncertainty for the creative industry in Canada that will be, I fear, quite devastating, because they've just come off the best 10 years in their history, and the last 2 years of that decade pre-COVID were the best years for, I mean, the industry grew by 80% in 10 years, because the best thing the CRTC ever did about streaming was nothing, and just let things develop in terms of that. And it was very prosperous. So all film and TV programming, Francophone production, and certified Canadian content all had the last 2 years were best years ever. And it was growing fabulously. Creating all this uncertainty will definitely suppress investment. To what extent, it's hard to say, but I fear that Minister Guilbeault and the lobbies that have convinced him he's doing the right thing may very well be killing the golden goose with this act. So is that gloomy enough for you?
Well, yes, it's pretty gloomy. I mean, in a way, it suggests that some of the most abject fears that we're all going to be censored tomorrow might, in fact, be overdone, because nothing is going to happen tomorrow.
Oh no! Oh no! 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 The CRTC. It's one of the amazing arguments in this is that you will hear people say, and I've heard, I mean, the ministers say it, they were promoting the bill, but the CRTC doesn't regulate content. That's all it does when it comes to broadcasting, right? This is a revision of the Broadcasting Act. The Broadcasting Act is all about controlling speech. It might be subtle, you might not see it overtly, but you never see what you don't get to hear. Right? I mean, you're never aware of what you don't get to hear, right? I mean, if it's censored, you don't know it, right?
Yeah,
so it shapes the conversation. It shapes the conversation. The analogy I used, I stole from Tim, but it shapes the conversation the way a pitcher shapes water, right? It is all about, I mean, and don't get me wrong on this. It's not necessarily that the bureaucrats want to. It's that the Broadcasting Act instructs them to. It tells them what sort of system it must have. It tells them that the system must be of good standard. Now that's about as subjective as you can get, but they will try. And they will try because they have to, because that's what public servants do. You give them legislation and it's their job to execute it. So yes, your speech will definitely be a feature of this.
Okay, well, that's a great segue to Joanna, because the main thing I'm going to ask her to address up front is, if we find ourselves being deprived of our charter right to free speech, what sort of remedies, if any, are we likely to have?
Well, the first thing that I want to mention is that I was happy to see, I was happy to see that finally a platform, I was waiting to see if Facebook was going to say anything about this, and they didn't. But Google actually just made a statement about C-10 today, and they said if C-10 rules were to go into effect as currently written, people would be seeing suggestions not based on their personal preferences or even what is most relevant, but based on what the government decides is Canadian. So that certainly suggests that if the bill were to pass, that we would see an immediate challenge from a group like Google, and probably a group like the Canadian Constitution Foundation would be involved as well. But it's important to note that this bill does not just target big tech, i.e. Facebook and Google, which controls most of the platforms that we engage with, but podcasts, apps, workout apps, audiobooks, sports websites, adult websites, the gamut, right? This is, as Heritage Minister Guilbeault mentioned, the entire internet. And so we need to consider what it really means to empower the CRTC to make distinctions on speech and really what your feed looks like. There's a principle of net neutrality that was of some controversy in the US a few years ago. And the principle is that service providers should not tweak your feed based on their objectives. And here we have the government sort of inserting itself in the role of a service provider to modify what your feed looks like. And I've indeed heard some Liberal MPs, Anthony Housefather, who's a Liberal MP, and his defense of C-10 was that, well, we already know that the platforms are, using an algorithm that tilts your feed in a specific way, but here we're doing it in a way that's good. That's promoting social cohesion. That is elevating content creators. And it's kind of like two wrongs don't make a right. I'm not saying that, algorithmic transparency isn't a good thing. And there's a separate bill, C-11, that is meant to address that hasn't gotten much interest. But to get back to the right to freedom of speech, Section 2B of the Charter, it's certainly the right both to speak and to be heard, maybe not to be prominently on everybody's YouTube home feed if you're a content creator, certainly not, but also not to be deliberately suppressed in a very all-encompassing, very opaque way. And in terms of minimum impairment, so I think it's clear, I don't think there's any debate that there is a limitation on the right to free speech here, whether you're a content consumer, a content creator, a platform, whatnot. But then the question will be whether it is minimally impairing and whether it can be justified in a free and democratic society. This is Section 1. And I think given the range of much less intrusive measures that we can imagine, given the fact that we don't know how this will actually work to achieve the purported objective of leveling the playing field and of making things balanced. And also, as Peter has mentioned, given that it's not even clear that this is a pressing need, given the performance of Canadian content creators who 90% of them have vast audiences outside of Canada and who indeed seem to be thriving. So the last thing that I want to mention, since I am the resident lawyer, so bear with me, is that the Liberal government has adopted a practice of attaching a charter statement to proposed legislation. Basically, an analysis from the Department of Justice assessing whether the bill is charter compliant. And this is just was pretty shocking to me to read, and I think is very telling of the posture of this government, in addition to the comment of Mr. Housefather that I mentioned that, well, Google has an algorithm, so why can't we have an algorithm? And so this is their charter statement. I'll just read parts of it. The Commission, the CRTC, is subject to the Charter and must therefore exercise its discretionary powers in a manner consistent with the Charter. The Act provides it must be interpreted and applied in a manner consistent with the Charter-protected right to freedom of expression. And it goes on, but you don't have to be trained in law to see that this is highly circular. The Commission has discretion, yes, but they're going to exercise their discretion in accordance with the right to freedom of expression. So in other words, what the government wants you to do is stop worrying and love the CRTC. And very broadly, we do see this trend of these regulatory bodies that are tasked with very value-rich decisions, like what is Canadian, what promotes Canadian values. These are unelected bureaucrats that are making these decisions that essentially curate our view of the world. And I don't think it would be accepted by a judge happily, but it certainly should not be accepted by us.
Thank you. Yes, that John Locke actually let loose a fiery blast, or possibly a dusty one, at the concept of delegating rulemaking power from legislators. The sort of thing that gets me excited, but perhaps not everybody. So instead, before I go to JJ, I want to mention that Jordan Peterson tweeted that he has 1 million more YouTube subscribers than the CBC, and he wondered, therefore, what his status would be. Well, JJ McCullough, who like me makes a living annoying people, but is apparently better at it since he's got over 300,000 YouTube subscribers, though we have nearly 60,000 at the Climate Discussion Nexus. So we're yapping at his heels. So I want to ask, what does it look like to you if this bill passes? How does this seem to you to threaten what you do?
Well, I think that one of the things that strikes a lot of people is that they wonder how government could possibly control content in this way. Like, how could government determine, what sort of meets their criteria to be promoted on the YouTube main page, on the YouTube discoverability tab, how to affect sort of search results. Like, obviously, they're not going to pay some sort of bureaucrat to watch every single YouTube video and then sort of rank them accordingly. But the fact is that YouTube already has quite sophisticated content sort of sorting metrics that they use. Every time I go to upload a video, I already have to check a bunch of boxes that either affirm or deny the sort of content that my video contains. I have to check a box that says, is there any gruesome violence in your video? Is there any sex in the video? It even actually gets quite gradated. I won't, get into all of the lurid details, but they have like very explicit, say, different sort of standards of sort of sexual explicitity, right? Where you can sort of say, does your video have this in it? Does it have that in it? If it has this, then check that box. If it has that, check that box. And so anyway, the point is that all of this information is user submitted and is used by YouTube to determine how accessible to different types of audiences your content is. If I self-select and say that my content is full of gruesome, bloody violence and so on and so forth, well then, it'll be harder for young users of the site to find it in their discoverability and so on and so forth. So my big fear is that if this goes through and if the CRTC sort of comes up with their sort of checklist of what is good Canadian content that more Canadians should be consuming, that YouTube will be forced to basically impose a test like this to all content creators. And thus, when I go to upload my next video, instead of simply having to say, is my video too violent or too full of swears or whatever, I'll also have to like answer affirmative questions about, are there people of color in the video? Does your video sort of involve Canada's 2 official language communities? Is there LGBT content? Does it help the cause of Indigenous reconciliation? Right? All of the things that we know in Bill C-10 are sort of listed in a laundry list of the sort of objectives that this new legislation sort of seeks to achieve in a kind of moralistic, sort of spiritual sense for the betterment of the nation. And so, there is a sense that I have 300,000 YouTube subscribers. I mean, that's not, it might sound impressive to some people. It's not the most heroic accomplishment. I actually was looking it up the other day, and I am the 1,468th most popular Canadian YouTuber. There are over 100 Canadian YouTubers that have over 3 million subscribers each. There's probably well over, I would think, possibly hundreds of Canadian YouTubers that have at least 1 million subscribers each. So those people are all doing well. You could say that I'm making a comfortable living, I'm doing well. But the sort of people that I worry about are the people that are sort of entering this realm of content creation now. The people that are trying to make a living as in this sort of new, vibrant entrepreneurial industry going forward, the young people of tomorrow. They will have to play by a very different set of rules than someone like me or someone like these hundreds of YouTubers that already have millions of subscribers. They will have to make, in order to be successful, I very much fear that they will have to make content that is politically sensitive in a way that people like me or you, John, never really had to be as worried about. I mean, it would, in theory, it would also hurt me. Like, it would hurt my ability to be naturally discovered. This, what they call sort of organic discovery, which is still how and I think actually most YouTubers get the majority of their audience is through, just random thumbnails that pop up as determined by YouTube's own algorithm of discoverability. So there's a lot of reason, I think, to be concerned that if this goes through, sort of the golden era that sort of Peter was referring to is sort of coming to a close, and you're just going to see a lot more politically driven, politically motivated content that is being created with an eye towards gaming the system in, I think, the same way that you see a lot of CanCon made for traditional broadcast media is made with an eye towards gaming the system, making content that sort of appeases CRTC rules and obligations rather than creating content that is genuinely popular with the public and desired by them.
Yeah, and it is interesting. One of the questions that's been asked in a number of forums has to do with how you judge Canadianness. I, of course, also have to check off those boxes about, does it contain things that might upset people? And funnily enough, apparently climate change denialism doesn't fall into that category, though a lot of people do seem to get upset by it. And I was imagining the House of Commons feed that have to be checking it, does it contain nudity? And it's like, well, not on purpose. And you can just one anecdote about the weird things that can happen because of the weird stuff people watch online. There's a popular chess YouTuber. You wouldn't know that was a category, but it is, called Agadmator. And at one point he got banned from YouTube because he was looking at one position and commented, "Now white's better than black here." And it was like, but that got reversed. But I want to ask the panelists, I mean, will they be trying to determine what Canadianness is, and what technically, how would they police that? Is it who made it? Is it the content? Is it both? Is it being left wing?
Let me have a crack at that, John. That's one of the things that it's left to the CRTC to define. What is and isn't, what will and won't qualify as Canadian content. Now, there are a set of rules already in place that are designed for the broadcasting world, and there's a formula called, I can't remember what the acronym stands for, but it's spelled out MAPL, M-A-P-L. And there is essentially, somewhat as JJ described, there's a series of boxes you have to tick. You know, like the construction of your band, where the music was, who wrote the music, who plays the music, et cetera, or in the case of film, who the producer is, et cetera. And it's it essentially it really represents one of the big struggles here is that you have within the Broadcasting Act and the official CanCon industry, an entire industry that has been created to meet regulatory needs, not to meet consumer preferences. In fact, if anything, to suppress consumer preferences and say, I know you want candy, but here's the broccoli that we prefer that you consume. But that process itself to create the laws that they have, or the regulations they have now, was excruciating and long, and this would be even more so. So decide whether you are producing content which is approved of by the state regulator. State regulator will be a big issue. It'll impose a lot of regulatory costs. JJ will have to hire another lawyer. He'll have to hire a regulatory affairs person. He'll have to get on a plane and go back and forth to Ottawa frequently because they don't come and visit you. You get summoned. If you wish to participate, you will probably have to go there to be part of the hearings, which will be different because they're used to having the usual suspects in those meetings, which would mean the currently certified CanCon industry, big cable, big tech, big broadcasting. Hope that helped.
Question for Rachael, particularly, is there another bill to regulate the internet that's currently somewhere in the legislative pipeline?
So Joanna referenced this earlier. You might be referring to Bill C-11. Bill C-11 is quite a bit different than this bill in terms of its content and purpose. That one focuses a lot more on people's privacy, data ownership, algorithm transparency, or algorithmic transparency, I should say. So in other words, understanding how platforms like YouTube or TikTok or even Google, etc., use algorithms in order to direct us as users. So that bill is currently being discussed within the House of Commons. As Joanna mentioned again, it's not one that is, getting a lot of attention right now, just because Bill C-10 is really the pressing issue. So a lot of time and attention is being given to that. But C-11 will be the next one that deserves attention. I should also mention that the Heritage Minister, Minister Guilbeault, has indicated that we can anticipate further legislation from his department, and where he's planning to go next is what he's terming harmful speech, which is different than the term hate speech. And essentially, based on what I've been able to pick up from different events that I've been at with him, virtual events that I've participated at with him or listened to his voice on, is really where he's going with this, is trying to protect people from being offended, which I find very interesting and actually very scary, because people can choose to be offended with just about anything. And so if you're going to go around censoring what people say or what they post because it might be offensive, you're going to shut down free speech in an instant. And I think Canadians should be concerned, very concerned, about the potential of that coming down the pipeline.
Was
And
the
if I could
iron-
just tack on to the online harms bill, we've also heard that the bill is currently envisioning potentially 3 new regulatory bodies: social media regulator, an appeal board, and a social media advisory board. And it looks like the favored approach is going to be to use the German model with mandated takedowns of potentially harmful content within 24 hours. So we're even more worried about that bill, which we hear murmurs of from stakeholders and from people like Rachael and what they've heard. So unfortunately, things don't look like they're going to get any better.
And-
And that, so the irony about prohibiting things that offend people is that I'm offended by it. But I just reposted, there's a very interesting video that someone had sent me, a woman, about how she got out of wokeness because she found that it was causing her to be filled with resentment. And it's not just about wokeness. There's all kinds of ways we can go around looking for grievances. And I suggest that some of the people in the chat might think about this too. But it could very much offend someone that you said, don't be so offended all the time. Which then it raises the question, given that we already have laws against hate speech, and given that this other bill might bring in even stronger protections, C-10 itself, what power would it give the government to control what we say, as opposed to merely trying to smush us down to the bottom of the search results? One of the questioners said, would Rebel News be off the air the next day? Would C-10 permit that by extending the government's power to limit what it considers obnoxious speech? How does this go beyond existing laws against, sedition and libel and incitement to violence, and then the rather more nebulous hate speech?
Well, as you inferred there, John, the internet doesn't exist outside of the law. All of those, when a lot of this gets wrapped up in, well, we have to do something about hate speech. Well, I mean, arrest somebody then, because the law exists, right? And it applies to the internet just as much as it applies to any place else. What's kind of troubling is there's an idea here somehow that you're going to take these rights and have them apply differently on the internet than you would in normal society. Like if there are behaviors and speech patterns that you want to control, like shouting fire in a crowded theater, sedition, libel, slander, etc. These are laws that should apply everywhere, whether you're shouting it out in a coffee shop, standing on a street corner saying it, or putting it on your Facebook page, right? But there's this sense that that they can get away with it because they're managing web giants, right? In terms of managing their speech on there. But like I said, the law already applies for that, and trying to smuggle in what I would think is unjustifiable further suppression of free speech through some sort of sense that you're cracking down on web giants is just intellectually dishonest.
And I suppose they're also taking advantage of the fact that there's a lot of obnoxiousness online. I mean, I suppose people have always had dark thoughts in their hearts, but I feel like in the old days, perhaps out of considerations for their dental work, they tended to keep them rather better under control. I can't believe the kind of comments, even on the climate discussion nexus, and I'm going to be quite blunt here, not just the people attacking us, some of the people supporting us post things that I really wonder if their mother knows they post stuff like that, and what's worse, maybe she does it too. So I think maybe that might help them push stuff like this through, because people are aware that it's pretty nasty out there. But that, which is my wind up to asking a question, which I think I know Peter's view, because I think it's actually a quotation from him. But is this bill really a solution in search of a problem? Is it trying to fix something that's just not there at all and risking doing a lot of collateral damage in pursuit of goals that are either unclear or pointless?
Well, if I may, I think that you do kind of have to see this as more of a, like, not to use sort of overheated language, but like in terms of like, is this censorship or is this propaganda? And I'm much more inclined to see this as like a propaganda type of initiative rather than a censorship type of initiative, because I think that the objective is much more promotion of certain politically correct, in sort of the old-fashioned sort of sense of that term, content over the suppression of quote unquote bad content, right? That might be coming in subsequent legislation, but I think that the driving sort of objective of this particular initiative is the idea that the government knows best in terms of what sort of content the people of Canada should be consuming. The government has a vested interest in sort of contributing to the cultural, spiritual betterment of the public through their consumption of popular media. So that is, I think, it can sometimes be a little bit difficult for people to I think, grasp the seriousness of that, because I think that for perfectly legitimate reasons, we're all kind of in a heightened sense of awareness of the dangers of censorship and you know, threats to freedom of speech and so forth. But I think the idea of government playing an active role in attempting to dictate the shape and tone and content of popular culture, of entertainment, of education. I mean, a tremendous amount of educational content is available on YouTube. And I think at a time when the traditional education system has its share of deficits, a lot of young people are learning a great deal about the world through sites like YouTube. I think that we should all be very, very concerned about the idea of government putting their finger on the scale and attempting to sort of, you know, engineer the public through their ability to freely consume the kind of content that they want to consume in order to educate and entertain themselves freely on their own terms. That to me is like the biggest consideration, the biggest concern that I have, particularly given, again, like what a sort of robust kind of self-directed, self-initiated educational and enlightening sort of, I think, place the internet can be when left to its own devices, when able to exist in a sort of purely free market, consumer-driven environment.
So, and Joanna, if the darker fears about this bill should turn out to be justified, how likely are the courts to provide relief? I remember reading, it was Richard Moon's book on the court's tendency to take a Lockean analysis of whether rights were infringed, and very often say, yes, your rights are infringed, but then take a sociological one and say, yeah, but it's justified in a free and democratic society because the state knows best. So are we likely to run into courts that will uphold either the negative kind of censorship where views are suppressed, or else what JJ's talking about, where the promotion of certain points of view over others? If you go to court, how likely are you to find judges that see it our way?
Well, unfortunately, it is a little bit of a game of Russian roulette currently. Certainly at the current Supreme Court, there are probably only 2 or 3 judges that are reliably pro-free speech. And one of the other problems, as if anybody saw the sort of US Congress questioning of Mark Zuckerberg a few years ago, know this phenomenon where a lot of our judges are not exactly of the technological generation and don't have the same type of intuitive understanding. So that is kind of just like a thing that's operating in the background. I will say one thing that the judges will understand is they understand that this is an amendment to the Broadcasting Act. And so they'll go back to the original objectives of that act and justification. And one of the things that I think will be salient is that the Broadcasting Act was justified by the fact that there's finite amount of radio airwaves, finite amount of hours of television programming, and the internet simply does not have that same justification where you have to dole out the airwaves in a way that that keeps the Canadian conversation going. One other thing that will come up, particularly at the Supreme Court, is they are very politically sensitive to Quebec, and of course the demographic that has been most enthusiastically supportive of Bill C-10 is Quebec, perhaps for good reason. Perhaps they do have reason to perceive themselves as culturally threatened, although I certainly don't think that this whole act is necessary to alleviate those concerns. I don't think anybody in this group would be in favor of a direct tax and subsidy, but it would certainly be more streamlined than what is proposed here. So bottom line, I couldn't say for certain that the courts would see it our way, but I do think that there are major problems with the bill. There are major problems with, for example, the Justice Minister, David Lametti, who was actually one of my law professors at McGill, didn't even show up at the committee hearing where his charter statement was read. And I'm pretty sure he would have given it a failing grade.
And at some point,
if I might pop in there, there's another argument that's been raised on this by Philip Palmer, who is with the Internet Society of Canada branch. Phil was a lawyer, is a lawyer. He's retired now, but he was involved in writing the Broadcasting Act. And there's sort of a he believes, and others have been in agreement with him, that there's a potential constitutional issue here, in that federal authority over broadcasting is established because radio wave spectrum crosses interprovincial boundaries in a fashion that that is distinctly different from how internet transactions occur, internet conversations occur, and therefore they might not even have authority there. So probably somebody's going to challenge on that basis. And historically, so people know, I mean, yes, speech is controlled through the Broadcasting Act, through broadcasting licenses and that sort of stuff. But as was just pointed out, that was justified by the fact that spectrum is a crown asset and of finite supply. But all of that was always transactional. So if you, John, wanted to get a radio license and I was handing them out, I would say, okay, you want to make some money, John? You want to use this crown asset to make money? Here's the deal. Here's the rules. I'm like the landlord and you're the tenant. Here's how we expect you to conduct yourself. And you can say freely yes or no. So you want to make money? You say yes. I'll follow the rules. This is not transactional, what is anticipated with the internet. This is, I'm making the rules. They're not asking my permission to agree to the rules. They're just making them.
Okay, and I said at the beginning we were going to keep to our schedule because we appreciate people giving us their time and we don't believe in encroaching on it. I was once at a conference on human rights where a very famous human rights advocate proceeded to eat up most of somebody else's time, which I thought was an interesting spectacle. Whatever failings I might have, that's not one of them. So what I would like to do now before turning it over to Troy to wrap it up is to ask each of the panelists, what should people who don't want to see Bill C-10 passed, or if passed, implemented in the ways that we're concerned about, what should people do to try constructively to stop this from having the bad effects, or at least the worst effects that it potentially might? And we'll just go through in the order that we started. So Rachel, start with you. What should people do if they want to try and stop this thing?
Thank you for the question, John, and also thank you so much for being our moderator today. You've done an exceptional job, and it's such a privilege to be on this panel with each person here. To answer your question, and I really appreciate it because I think we can talk about these issues and become very passionate about them, and rightfully so. But we don't often get around to the question of, well, how do we act then? What's possible? And so I very much appreciate that. Here's what my encouragement would be as a member of Parliament is I would say, every single letter or email or phone call counts. And sometimes we get a little intimidated because we think that it needs to be, like all proper and articulated perfectly. No, it doesn't. Write a one-sentence email. Write it to Minister Guilbeault and tell him to stop Bill C-10. Tell him to kill Bill C-10. Tell him to stop infringing on your right to free speech. It just takes one sentence and it's powerful. It sends a message. I think the other thing that individuals who are viewing this, who might want to become active on this file might do is share this on your social media pages. Share this panel today. Share other content, other posts, articles that are being written. Certainly you're welcome to visit my Facebook page and share some of the content that I've posted there. Help make people aware of just how serious this issue is and the fact that the government is intending to infringe upon their freedom of expression, their freedom of opinion, their freedom of belief, and the way that is put online, which of course is the new public square. So there are certainly opportunities to be active, and I would very much encourage our audience to do so.
Okay, so that's sort of from the political end. I don't know if there is anything that could be done from the bureaucratic end, so I'll turn it over to Peter with that thought in mind. But if there are other things also that you would recommend, what do we do to prevent or at least limit the damage from this bill and the thinking behind it?
Well, there's two phases. One is Ms. Harder suggested there, where you take action now, and people could send emails, make phone calls to senators, in addition to MPs, because if it gets through the House, it's the next chance for it to die on the vine would be the Senate in terms of that. But assuming it would go through, as I indicated earlier, there will be years of regulatory proceedings, and I think. If this is going to be rescued at all, that's where people have to be prepared to engage with the CRTC. These decisions are typically made by 9 government appointees, and the organization is notoriously non-transparent. There are, minutes of meetings aren't posted. There are no recorded votes. These things can be held in public or not in public, just by a sort of submissions process, and decisions are made. So it'll be important for people to actually organize in some way, I think, and be prepared to present themselves to the CRTC and, do the full Gandalf, you shall not pass on that, and really gear up. It's a process that traditionally, like I said, doesn't engage regular citizens. The consumer is never even mentioned in the Broadcasting Act. So people need to, I think, get ready to cowboy up and cowgirl up, and get ready to let the CRTC hear their noise.
Okay, well, any recommendation that includes a reference to the Lord of the Rings gets my vote, that's for sure. And before I ask Joanna, I'm going to say the first thing that I think she would want to say, because it is, I think, very important. And it is, I do have a dog in this fight too, but it's not as big and direct as hers. Donate to organizations like the Canadian Constitution Foundation. I am horrified at the amount of money that people will give to political parties in this country versus the amount they will give to the think tanks and the nonprofits and all the organizations that are trying to move the goalposts. And I would submit to you that much of the money, sorry, Rachel, but much of the money you give to political parties is wasted. And when you look at the budget of something like any of the political parties, and then you look at the budget of the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, or the Fraser Institute, or the C.D. Howe Institute, or the CCF, or the JCCF, and all these outfits that are trying to change things, Canada Strong and Free. If people would give half the money they give to the political parties to the intellectual and institutional infrastructure, the private stuff, I think it would be a huge help. And that does include the Climate Discussion Nexus, but it also includes the CCF. So other than giving you folks money, which I do, so I'm not being a hypocrite here, Joanna, what do you think people should do to help? Maybe after it passes, how do they help minimize the harm?
Well, certainly stay in touch with the CCF. If you want to donate, that's great. But we also have a weekly freedom update. We do regular litigation, lots of stuff on COVID. We just got a win this week on the quarantine hotels. So stay informed, because we will lay out all of the analysis. And if you donate, that's great. But if you can't, we're happy to provide that value. I see a lot of comments of people saying that writing to MPs doesn't do anything. I don't think you should be that cynical. It is true that once an MP, once things reach a critical mass, it will come up in caucus, and they will be motivated usually to do something about it. And the last thing that I want to say, and I'm sure JJ will touch on this, but if there are content creators you follow, YouTubers, podcasters who are Canadian and who are not talking about C-10 and who don't understand how it affects them and the next generation of creators, write to them and tell them to get educated and to speak out about it, because a lot of the push for this bill purportedly is coming from the artistic community, who think in very short vision terms that this is going to help them. And so having those people in the creator community speak up, JJ has some great short, very entertaining videos about C-10, but a lot more Canadian YouTubers should as well.
Whoops. And for JJ, of course, I'm going to say the first thing he's going to say, which is subscribe to his channel. Right? Very important to show people that the cloud is out there, and while you're at it, subscribe to mine. But other than that obvious thing, which probably all the people watching already did, and if not, they should. JJ, what do you think people should do to try and stop this?
No, I mean, I agree completely with what Joanna just said. Like, people should really put the pressure on the creator community. I think the creator community on YouTube, but also on Instagram, TikTok, whatever, I think that they have sort of been woefully unengaged with this issue. And I think that some of that goes to what I was talking about before, whereas I think that because a lot of content creators have been successful in the old unregulated system and sort of presume that they will continue to be successful in whatever system occurs in the future, there's been a kind of lack of engagement with, I think, the seriousness of this legislation. I think a lot of creators have a sense that they don't want to, quote unquote, get political, you know, because a lot of the most successful Canadian YouTube content creators are not in fact political. They make videos about pop culture, entertainment reviews, tech reviews, cooking, fitness, all of this kind of thing. But I think it's very important for people that consume high quality content that is in fact apolitical, put the pressure on these sorts of people to speak out about this, to make it the stakes of what is being proposed very clear to their audiences, and saying, if you enjoy having high quality, you know, Canadian made but apolitical content, and you don't want to see your subscription feed, you know, gummied up with a bunch of content that Ottawa thinks you should be watching instead of the kind of content that you do, well, then it's important that you put your pressure on your politicians. But it's also important that this becomes a mainstream topic of conversation. I want everyone in Canada to know what Bill C-10 is. I want everybody to be talking about it. And I want the creator community to feel like that this is an issue that they have to have an opinion on, that they have to speak out against on behalf of their audience for whom this matters a great deal. And we've seen, you know, social movements of this sort can be very successful. Obviously, we're seeing it right now as relates to the situation with the Indigenous peoples, right? Like people change their profile pictures and all this kind of thing. We see these sorts of movements rise, but they do tend to, you know, rise from the bottom up. People have to be convinced that this is an important enough issue so that people like me feel guilty and anxious when we're not speaking out against it.
Okay, well, we're just about done here. I'm going to throw in my own 2 cents worth because Rachael talked about, you know, you don't have to have it be too polished, have it be sincere. And I think that's very important. I think MPs are suspicious if it's too polished, that it's some coordinated manufactured campaign. But having said that, I'm going to say, remember, suaviter in modo, fortiter in re, be firm on the substance, but be polite in the way that you present it. As Dale Carnegie said, you never win if you start, you're an idiot because. And one of my many rules of public policy, if they think you're a clown, don't show up in a fright wig. So, you know, don't say you're all a bunch of Nazis, and because that doesn't change the course of the debate. So do keep that under control. And with that, I want to thank the panelists all again very much for bringing their expertise and their commitment and helping us to understand this issue and see what we're going to do about it. I would like to thank Troy for organizing it and now pass it over to him for the wrap up.
Well, thank you, John. You did an excellent job. You're going to be invited back again after that performance. Just absolutely exceptional. And thank you, of course, to all of our panelists. I was only going to add that I think we might be aided on this issue a bit by reaching out to some folks on the left, because it is a bit of an observation that it's not just those of us in the freedom movement or on the conservative side of the fence that are complaining about this. There are some on the other side. And I think the Liberals will listen to those people sometimes more than they'll listen to us. So just an added suggestion on what we can do about this going forward. So just a reminder that, again, this exchange call will be posted to our website and our YouTube page within the next couple of hours. We'll be back in July with a planned discussion on housing. A special, very special thank you to our sponsor today, the Modern Miracle Network. We are the Canada Strong and Free Network. And if you appreciate the value of the work we're doing, take John's advice and please consider a donation. Thank you, everyone, for joining us, and we'll see you back in July. Bye for now.